Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. By foot, bike, road, or rail, the ground under our feet is something that we all rely on. Infrastructure for transport within and between towns can in turn shape the formation of those towns, more than just how people get around. Today I'm speaking with Ole Aasvik of the Institute of Transport Economics and the University of Oslo about his research into transport access, attitudes, and autonomy in Norway, especially cycling infrastructure, and how the ease of use for any part of public roads can affect, or be affected by, the people who use it. Ole, hello.
Good morning to you.
Could you tell us a bit about yourself, your research, what led you to working on transport, people, and society?
Yeah, sure. For me personally, it was kind of random actually, because I was doing a master's degree in social psychology at the University of Oslo, and we had like this company. You had to be associated with a company for one of the subjects we had there to like do some applied research for them. And my current workplace was one of the companies that showed up. So in that regard, it was kind of random, but I mean, in transportation, there's always a lot of people, right? And social psychology is all about people and how they think when they're around other people. So, social psychology has a natural role in it in that kind of way. But for cyclists, generally, I think there's a lot of, at least in Norway, attention put on how to make more people cycle and how to make those who cycle enjoy it more.
Do you have any personal stake in the work, or do you keep a separation between life interests and research?
I've always thought of research. I mean, there's a lot of people who have research as their day job and also their hobby and also their life. I tend to fall kind of in between, I think. But of course, I do cycle a lot in my everyday life. I try to avoid using cars as much as possible, and I think it's nice for me to get out and cycle around. And of course, I stumble upon varying degrees of good and bad infrastructure and also maintenance and operation. So in that regards, it's also kind of personal.
Now, I happen to have just moved away from Bristol, which has a reputation for being a cycling city in the UK. There are other cycling cities across Europe, Amsterdam, for example, famed for its bikes. So, what does it take to make a city cycle friendly from either the top down or from the ground up?
It's an interesting question, right? Because it differs quite a lot between people. I think we intuitively can see that because, like a young man cycling really fast to get to his job and kind of doing his workout routine while he's biking to job, he may have different sets of requirements than an older gentleman who's just strolling along, going for like a nice ride during a sunny summer day. And also, for example, I have a son who is 2 years old, and we've done some like very basic cycling around the house, and every time we bump into like a hole in the road, he is just super excited because it's so fun to go down and kind of get stuck and find gravel in the bottom of the hole, and it's just a completely different experience for him. So it depends, I think, but there are some universals. Of course, you have to have some kind of straight pavement, and you have to have like some kind of ensured safety, right? Some separation from cars, perhaps, stuff like that. But this was kind of one of the goals that we had in this project, to figure out that stuff.
Is there anywhere that's doing especially well at this? Something as a role model for other cities to aspire to?
Yeah, sure. There are some. I mean, you mentioned already Amsterdam, and I think the Netherlands in general is kind of a gold standard in terms of numbers of cyclists. And also Copenhagen in Denmark, I know, have a lot of cyclists. Um, but also Oslo is trying really hard, and I mean that in a nice way. They put in several kinds of different measures to get more people to cycle, like improved signage, for example. They try to build and test out really different kinds of infrastructure to see what they enjoy the most, so the cyclists do. I also had a quick note actually about the differences between the Netherlands and Copenhagen on what they are doing well that perhaps is lacking in other countries, Norway in particular. And I think perhaps there are, of course, a lot of things that made those cities different to Oslo, but I think it's also become part of culture. So when you are in the Netherlands, you expect cyclists, so you don't step into a bicycle lane because you are going to get hit by the bike, right? And while in Norway, the separated infrastructure is much kind of more a novelty, and people aren't as used to it yet. So I kind of think that it has to do with culture in that regard, that people have to get used to it and consider it as a normal part of like the infrastructure and your everyday transportation life. And that is going to give a huge boost. It's a self-enhancing cycle, I think, in that regard.
From the sounds of things, it's much more city led than a total national initiative kind of idea. So, how locally does this kind of infrastructure managed? Who gets to be in charge of how those fit into national road schemes, and does everyone get to be involved in that kind of decision?
Yeah, it's also an interesting question, right? Because this research that I'm talking about today was funded by the Norwegian Public Roads Administration, which is kind of the state, the uppermost kind of governing body in Norway. But a lot of the roads that people cycle on daily are owned by the municipality and also the counties. So there's also been some, I guess, conflicts as to which, in the overlapping parts of the infrastructure, for example, where a municipality road goes over and meets a county owned road, there would be perhaps a better maintenance and operation for one of the roads and not the other. And that can create sort of a jarring, a cut almost in the infrastructure. So, in that sense, it's an interesting question. And I think there's still work to be done to get those two work more nicely together. But as you say, it's kind of generally a city center kind of phenomenon. But I mean, it's not necessarily just about the city centers, because also in smaller cities, I actually live outside of Oslo in a smaller city, and they also do some sort of measures to get more people to cycle, like oh God, what are they called again? Like sharrows are called. They are cyclist arrows. So they put a little cyclist figure. They paint it into the asphalt in the car lane, and they put they put arrows with cyclists in the car lane to basically try to get people to be aware that it is possible to cycle on the roads also.
That does lead handily into my next question on how road infrastructure doesn't belong to any one user group. I mean, we've got cyclists, pedestrians. I mean, around me, we've even got horses and farm equipment. With all those different stakeholders in mind, I suppose there's a lot to balance in terms of who wants what and how much each of those groups get.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess every kind of road user would just have the road to themselves if they could choose, like their dream scenario, right? So perhaps not the horses. I don't know much about horses, but they are different, I guess. But yeah, for sure. I mean, some cyclists we found would rather like to get separated from pedestrians than cars, actually, because they find pedestrians to be a nuisance when they're cycling, because they're going fast. Pedestrians are kind of unpredictable. They swerve from left to right. At least cars, they're going to stay in the lane, I guess, most of the time at least. And there's some predictability to us to how they're going to act. But also cyclists in meeting with other cyclists could be the same kind of problem if you're kind of just out for a Sunday stroll, like the older gentleman I was describing earlier, and you get all these young people just zooming past you. It's going to do something to your perception of what it's like to be a cyclist. So I think those differentiations are important and also really interesting from a research standpoint.
To focus on safety and risk for a second, and the burden of responsibility amongst the human operators of whatever mode of transport they happen to be in. What are the perceptions and maybe any adjustments that road users make to deal with those around them?
That's really interesting, actually, because there's been not a debate, I would say, but some back and forth in Norway recently between one of my colleagues who suggested that, because we find in some of our research that actually, like the stones you put to differentiate different road users, like the pavement goes up a notch and you have a stone that marks that divide, those are actually some of the main causes of single bicycle accidents, that people ride into them and like topple over and fall. And if you put more of those in, like you have a car and then separated by like a sharp stone, you have cyclists, and then another step up and another stone, you have pedestrians. the more stones, the more accidents is basically his claim, and it's backed by research. But it's kind of opposing to the idea that you want separation for safety's sake, right? So it's the difference between safety and security, I guess. The one is perceived, and the other one is like the real, like what is your risk riding here? It's very interesting, actually.
To focus on safety and risk for a second, and the burden of responsibility amongst the human operators of whatever mode of transport they happen to be in, what are the perceptions and maybe any adjustments that road users make to deal with those around them?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of can't, right? Because cyclists are also a very heterogeneous kind of a group, as well as every other road user, I guess. So it's kind of difficult to say something like definite about what they think and how they're going to act. But I guess there's some things that are just universally bad, like having tons of holes in your pavement and stuff like that. So
Is there then any nudge or intervention that can be put in place to try and encourage a more communal attitude for people using the space that they're in?
you're ringing so many bells in my head right now. It's difficult to pick where to start. My research group has done a lot of research on exactly these kinds of things. So nudging has been like a huge fad, I would say, in psychology and applied psychology for the last decade or so, since it was popularized by the Nobel Prize winners and so forth. And we also try to apply like the nudging mentality to stuff in Oslo. For example, we have some large intersections with a lot of traffic and also a lot of cyclists. And we had an issue like the road authorities had an issue with people or cyclists, particularly running red lights. So they wanted people to stop when they saw a red light instead of just like look left and right and just go for it. So they put small footrests at the side of the red light stops, so as to encourage people to stop there, like in an easier way to use the footrests. So we've been evaluating those kinds of measures as well. And also, you said some stuff about like the herd mentality almost of cyclists. This is also a very famous research finding, in at least from my colleagues, the safety in numbers effect. So everywhere you have more cyclists, there's going to be less risk per cyclist. So, for example, we investigated a junction in Norway, um, where there were a lot of cyclists, just because in Norway you have to yield when you're cycling across the road. You have to get off your bike and just walk across in order for the cars to have to yield the right of way to you. But if you just bike across, you're basically registered as another car and you have to like stop for the cars. But of course, everybody's going to go get faster to their destination if the bikes just like bike across the footpaths, right? So we have some interesting findings there where the first cyclist to approach the junction kind of makes this negotiation with the car, and every other cyclist that kind of follows suit in like relatively close, they also benefit from that negotiation, and it kind of carries over to the next cyclist, because they know if they were to bike up to the junction, stop, get off their bike and walk across, that will take more time for them and also perhaps for the cars, right? So we see these kinds of effects all the time. There's also been a lot of research into behavioral adaptation and risk perception. In Norway, it's a long country with long, dark winters. And in some of our research, we found that when we lit those roads, we think that, oh, it's going to be much more safe. People can see other traffic coming, pedestrians, cyclists. And also, we have issues with the moose running into the roads in Norway, typical Norway problems. So when we lit the roads, we thought this is going to be much safer, right? But what we found was that people compensated for that perceived safety by riding even faster in the cars. But for other kinds of problems, we found that these kinds of safety and security behaviors is kind of a safety package. So people who, to start off with, don't feel safe, they put on a lot of safety gear to feel safe, and then they like are happy campers. But other people, when they put on safety gear, they compensate by going faster. So it's not really clear. And also here, of course, as researchers always say, more research is needed.
Now, talking about your most recent paper specifically, then, could you walk me through some of the rationale and survey design and kind of how you set about answering the research questions?
We have done, as I mentioned, some actually quite a lot of research on specific like intersections and solutions to like road user separation and stuff like that. But there's really not a lot of research done like trying to gauge the entire public of Norway, for example, on how they feel about different levels of maintenance and operation, and also the infrastructure. I mean, is a hole in the road worse than riding on snow, for example? These are things that are really important for the Norwegian Public Roads Administration when they are to assign funds to these different activities, but they really didn't have a good way to determine or to gauge between those. So that's the main motivation, I would say, for this research. And of course, a large online survey is the best way to get feedback from a lot of people really quickly. So this is where my social psychological training, I guess, kicks in, because we've done a lot of research on using surveys, online surveys specifically, and we often measure things that are supposedly not visible, like intelligence, for example, is a classic example. You know when someone is more intelligent or less intelligent, at least to some degree, but it's really different from measuring the weight of a stone, for example. So psychologists have developed a host of different ways to investigate those kinds of things, and attitudes towards infrastructure, for example, is also like an immeasurable thing in some ways. So, but we also wanted to not just look at abstract kind of attitudes and thoughts about these topics, because when I tell you about an icy road, right, you might picture something, but if I talk to a Norwegian from like the northernmost part of Norway and talk to him about an icy road, that might be something completely different, right? It might be like a glacier or something. I don't know. So we really wanted to also put pictures in people's minds, like literally. We had pictures in the survey that people were supposed to assess as well. So we asked those abstract questions, but also had the pictures, which is not mentioned in the article, but it was part of the larger research project and the same survey actually. We actually, the last couple of years, have had some difficulty in recruiting cyclists in particular. We know that many cyclists are really vehemently cyclists, and they like to represent their group and like fight the cars for the ownership of the road and stuff like that. But it's difficult to get a lot of like regular cyclists to answer like academic surveys. So we had a host of different ways of reaching them, like sending out emails using Facebook and the Norwegian Cyclists Association. And in total, we were quite happy. We got like 2,500 cyclists, and about 2,300 were included in the analysis. We had to discard some because of some data filtering that we did.
Amidst all of the survey setup and distribution, what kind of questions were you asking? And, were they all pursuing the main research focus directly, or was there, some data to gather to flesh the picture out?
Yeah, so there were a bunch actually. It was a really long survey, perhaps too long, some would say. But so we kind of chose some that would tell a coherent story for this article in particular. But of course, those we chose were, I think, very crucial. So we asked people whether or not they had forfeited cycling, for example, due to poor operation and maintenance, which is kind of to the point exactly what we want to figure out, and look at geographic variation and also basic demographic information, because when there's not a lot of research done, you have to start somewhere, right? So we kind of started from the bottom with like the most basic kind of information. But yeah, forfeit cycling due to poor conditions, it was one. Also, how much you cycle, of course, is very crucial in investigating these, because people who cycle more either do so because they find conditions to be quite good, or they don't think the conditions are that bad because they cycle a lot. But they also might encounter more different kinds of conditions, right? So it's very important to control for that in the analysis. We had one hypothesis that women were going to be more affected by poor conditions than men, and that older people were going to be affected more than men. It was kind of based on previous research. And we did confirm the hypothesis that females were more exposed to bad conditions than men. They reported cycling less and more often forfeiting cycling due to poor conditions. So that was kind of confirmed, at least as far as this study goes. Also, while controlling for things like how often you cycle, right? They still forfeited cycling more often than men. And also, in terms of the age difference, we found that surprisingly, actually, older cyclists were less likely to have experienced an accident where conditions contributed. and they were also less bothered by holes and bumps. So in general, older cyclists weren't as bothered by poor maintenance and operation, which is kind of surprising because you would think that they were kind of more brittle, perhaps, for less stable cyclists, more issues with their balance and stuff like this, but really not. And in the discussion section, we kind of tried to make sense of that because it was kind of shocking to us. But I think the best kind of explanation we have is that perhaps older cyclists aren't in a rush as often. They perhaps have more time. They may be more experienced cyclists. So it's really difficult to make a good sense of that, I think.
Now, as you've mentioned, this is a very Norway-specific survey, but is there any way that these findings could be either transferred or compared around, neighbouring countries in Sweden or so? Maybe there's even countries further away, but with a very comparable seasonality to them. Thinking of, Scotland or maybe even across into Canada.
Yeah, for sure. And I was always kind of surprised to find that Oslo is almost at the same latitude as Anchorage, Alaska. So it's really far north, and of course we have the Gulf Stream that provides a lot of heat and kind of balances out our climate. But at least in the western part of Norway, we found those kinds of results. Actually, they were less bothered by winter conditions in the west of Norway. Um, so that is, I guess, kind of like a European finding, to put it that way. But also, I think the finding or the geographic information is kind of valuable as well because we find that winter cycling really is different from cycling during the summer in Norway, at least for the most part. And men, to a larger extent than women, cycle during winter, and that's interesting, right? Because in some ways you would think, why is that? Why would men like prefer cycling in winter? What's the like explanation behind that? And I think future research could really pick up on that and try to figure out if that extends to like other kinds of conditions as well. And actually, a researcher sitting next to my office here in Oslo is doing a PhD in like route considerations based off of gender. So we know that females, for example, often have multiple stops on their way to work. For example, they bring their kids to kindergarten. They may do some shopping on the way home. And this also affects their route choices and how much they choose to cycle. Perhaps it's more convenient to take a car if you're going to the kindergarten both ways anyway. So there are a lot of different things that I think that the gender finding is a proxy for, which I think we need more research to look into. And I think that is a global finding. That is not Norway specific.
Based purely on uninformed instinct, I'd want to hear what those people are wearing. Because when I think of, the man type cyclists, my mental image doesn't typically include a flowing summery dress.
And this is actually also very interesting, yes, because we have like a stereotype in Norway that the people who work like in the center, the downtown of Oslo, they live out west in Oslo and they bike into Oslo using like tight-fitting cyclist clothes, and they ride really fast and they're a nuisance to everybody else. But they're the kind of cyclists that we think about, like when we say cyclist in Norway. I think at least some of them. But you mentioned actually clothing, and we have also done a lot of research on clothing, and specifically safety equipment and high visibility clothing. Um, yeah, so that's a whole separate kind of discussion, I think.
To take a more timeline view of things, is there any trend that you can see in change of use for cycling infrastructure across the last couple of years amongst those kind of demographics? You said there was the older cohort, but well, they were younger once. Was there any maybe a changing attitude, maybe changing usage, changing perspectives over a cyclist's life?
Yeah, it's a good question actually, and I wish that we had like a previous study done in 1970s or something that we could compare to. But it's even though it's kind of basic, just using like the basic social demographic information, it's kind of hard to measure that up to something that was done a long time ago because this wasn't on the plate a long time ago. This wasn't something that we thought about. Like in the 1960s, for example, there were a lot of focus on cars, and at least in Oslo, there were some hilarious plans to build like a highway through the downtown of Oslo because cars needed to be available everywhere, right? And everybody was going to ride a car. Now the tide has really turned on that, and in Oslo, there's been some legislation that is looking to prohibit cars from the inner city. Yes, there's been plans to ban cars from the inner city. So it's the tide has really turned on that one.
Now, thinking of the very recent past, as the pandemic set in, when people were working from home and driving less, and suddenly all of the roads freed up and people were out on their bikes. Was that something that your research captured as a kind of a time frame of when it was happening?
At least my colleagues have done. It was not reflected in my research because it was done before the pandemic, but we have done some survey research during the pandemic, and we found that, of course, people travel a lot less during the pandemic, as you say, working from home and stuff like this. But interestingly, we found that those who missed their commute were people who used to cycle. So for everybody else, or almost everybody else, the pandemic was kind of, is nice not to commute to work, work from home, it's really flexible, but those who used to ride a bike really missed that part of the commute. So I guess that says something about, one, those who usually cycle, they do it because they like it, uh, but also that it can be like a nice break from going from the private sphere to like the office sphere, and that it's a nice kind of changing of pace in your everyday life, I think.
On to the near future, then, thinking about the possible impacts of electric cars as a in commas sustainable option that might appeal to environmental drivers, and certainly the boom in popularity of electric scooters around me. Is that coming into play in infrastructure as well?
Oh God, yes, it is a lot of focus on e-scooters these days, and we also do a lot of research on e-scooters. And as you say, electric vehicles also very popular in Norway. I think we're like world leading in owning Teslas, something like this. But yeah, of course, the future is kind of hard to predict, anyways, right? But there's a definitely, I think e-scooters have come to stay, and we do a lot of research on like parking measurements, getting people to like put them away more nicely, because a lot of people, rightly so, I think, is kind of annoyed at how they are treated in the city at this point in time. But I think it's changing for the better. It's kind of a new thing, right? So we have to give it some time to settle. But there's also a lot of research looking at things like autonomous vehicles, because like Elon Musk likes to promote at every possible opportunity, self-driving vehicles is part of the future. And actually, I'm doing a PhD right now looking at shared autonomous shuttles. So it's kind of the public transport version of a self-driving Tesla. And this is going to change the city picture, right? If most of the traffic in cities is going to be autonomous and perhaps also part of the public transport. And there are also a large European project that I'm kind of associated with, called Shape It, looking at human machine interfaces and for autonomous vehicles, and how they should be designed to help cyclists and pedestrians better navigate a city environment where some or perhaps most of the other vehicles are autonomous. So I think this is also a really interesting strain of research.
Speaking personally for a second, given the lack of respect that cars give to buses with humans in around me, I am not sure that taking the human driver out is going to help anyone tremendously.
Yeah, no, it's actually true, and that was one of the things we investigated earlier, actually, that perhaps autonomous buses would be seen as weak road users, almost like cyclists, right? You mentioned earlier the car user that argued that they had a lot of kilograms of steel riding around them, so they were kind of safe in that negotiation nonetheless. And that autonomous shuttles would stop like at everything it detected. So we found actually a little effect like that, that the shuttles got kind of bullied around, but it kind of evened out over time as the novelty of it faded, I guess.
For anyone listening to this, be they cyclists or drivers or researchers, or any combination of those, or any of the other groups that we've discussed, what would you like for them to take away from our conversation today and your research overall?
I think a research paper is always written for your peers, right? So other researchers looking into this, I think this is a nice place to pick up from. Actually, it's not a conclusion of any sort at all. It's obviously needs validation from other cultures, but also perhaps taken a bit further as to what it is that causes people. What are the mechanisms that make, for example, women more cautious in poor conditions than men? Investigate those things further. And also, of course, the Norwegian Public Roads Administration should really look at the results. I think they did already, because they funded the research and it's part of like their development program. But also, of course, road authorities from other countries could at least look at the report with the pictures and see what real cyclists out there think is worse, a hole in the road or gravel on the road or shards of glass or
And lastly, where can people find more about you and your work?
this particular research program has kind of ended, at least as far as we are concerned. So it's not going to be directly connected to this, but we always do interesting research at the Institute of Transport Economics, which is where I work. A lot of it has to do with cyclists and trying to figure out how to make a better future for my son, even though he enjoys holes in the pavement very much. He might not do so in like 20 years. Uh, so I think that's a good way to find out more about the kinds of research that we're doing here. Just visit our webpage, the Institute of Transport Economics.